I'm Evgeny Morozov, and this is the final episode of the Santiago Boys. Today we are heading straight to the Valley of the Beast, Silicon Valley. It's certainly not where our protagonists were planning to end up when they took over the Catholic University in Santiago back in 1967. But their lives took a dramatic turn afterward, most of it due to Allende's surprising rise to the presidency. In Project Cybersyn, Allende's radical experiment to transform Chile's economy through computers played a major role as well. And now, with Allende gone, some of the Santiago boys stand ready to trade Che Guevara for Steve Jobs, the socialist revolution for the digital one. Others, however, do remain faithful to their original ideas. And then there is Stafford himself, who goes on a very different journey. More on that later. Stay with us. It's hard to imagine a more depressing time in Chile than the early 1980s. The country is still under the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet. The killing of Orlando Letelier did lead to the demise of Dina and the demotion of Pinochet's top henchman, Manuel Contreras. But state repression persists nonetheless. Even more shocking is that while Chileans are suffering, some people in other countries are admiring this terrible regime. They've been looking up on Chile as a model of economic success. They're impressed by how Pinochet and his Chicago boys have implemented all these radical free market reforms. Reforms that have supposedly turned Chile into a true economic miracle. The Guardian's Andy Beckett explains.
We have to remember that, especially in the late 70s and even in the early 80s, there were very few examples around the world of kind of neoliberal governments. So if you were a kind of right-wing government looking for these ideas, Chile was a very intriguing experiment to follow. And because it was an authoritarian regime, it meant that Pinochet could try things that could initially be extremely unpopular, and it didn't matter.
The British elites are particularly enamored of this free market utopia. Andy Beckett notes the irony.
So there's a kind of idealization of the Pinochet government that happens on the right in the 70s, a bit like the way the left earlier in the decade idealized Allende. So there's a kind of idea around on the right in Britain that democracy in Britain might be failing and the alternative might have to be some kind of authoritarian government.
One prominent British economist is really in love with the Chicago boys and their free market utopias. He's got quite the advantage too, being very close to Margaret Thatcher. His name is Alan Walters. But who exactly is he? Well, there is an interesting connection to our story here. Walters is actually a one-time business partner of Stafford Beer. Yes, they even tried to do some business together in Allende's Chile. That, of course, tells us that Stafford Beer could have easily found himself a comfortable consulting gig even under someone like Pinochet. To his credit, he never wanted that. Andy Beckett has the details on this Alan Walters guy.
He visited Chile after Pinochet had taken power and was rather intrigued and impressed by the kind of free market reforms that were happening. And then once Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, Alan Walters went backwards and forwards to Chile quite a few times.
The Iron Lady loves the Chilean model. Thatcher wants the UK to look very much like the market utopia that Pinochet has been building in Santiago.
Semi-officially, Margaret Thatcher was very interested in what he told her about what the government there was doing, but she told him to kind of keep it quiet, to not talk publicly about the fact that he was going to Chile, because she was worried, obviously, about the image that the regime had.
As Thatcher takes the reins of power in the UK, the country quickly emerges as the main defender of Pinochet in Europe. Watching all of that unfold must have been a truly gut-wrenching experience for Stafford Beer. His own government cozying up to the brutal dictator? Well, that must be an affront to everything he stands for. Enrique Farnet vividly recalls the meeting that Stafford had with him around that time.
He had a friend, a lady friend, who was a member of the Tory party.
After this lady makes some frivolous comments about communists, Enrique loses his temper.
I reacted to that. I said, no, don't say that. Don't say that. I've seen that happening. I've seen people kill it. But after that, I gave her like a political picture.
Stafford's reaction? Let's just say it is quite dramatic. He begs Enrique, and it seems that in begging Enrique, he's talking to the whole country of Chile for forgiveness.
Stafford stood and kneeled in front of me, and this woman was also very embarrassed. I don't know what I said. I don't know what I want.
Stafford's laid-back, hippie-like demeanor does raise some eyebrows. He no longer looks like a distinguished member of the Athenaeum Club. And to make matters worse, his political beliefs don't exactly align with those of polite society. And if that wasn't enough, he's also made it clear that he is not interested in working for British clients. Here's what Vanilla Beer told me.
They were busily torturing people in Northern Ireland, and he just wouldn't work for the Brits. So he really, his work pool was really shrinking as the world got more and more and more unpleasant. But he was a man of principle.
Nor would he touch anything involving the military-industrial complex. Here's Stafford reflecting upon his own post-Chilean radicalization in a session recorded in that busy Welsh pub. Apologies once again for the sound quality.
I never got any funds for anything because I wouldn't. I took a conscious decision that I would not work for this military-industrial complex, nor would I work for big business, and nobody else was offering anything anyway.
Rather than rubbing elbows with the cream of the crop in British society, he's chosen to isolate himself in his Welsh cottage. The days of caviar, lobsters, and champagne are long gone. Now he's surviving on a meager diet of trout and mashed potatoes, and that's on a lucky day. And the respectable world, all those consulting clients and universities and the media that in the past never left him alone, are not exactly seeking his opinions.
I've noticed that people don't ask me to talk to managers much these days.
But for anyone in the know, this is not exactly a mystery. Having worked for Allende, a man whose reputation was tarnished by a sustained propaganda effort against him, Stafford has become a black sheep of sorts, and a dangerous one at that, an unpredictable one. While some might get lost in the philosophical weeds, Fernando is all about taking in his ideas and putting them into action. He's got a well-rounded plan that includes expensive seminars, coaching sessions, consulting gigs, and even software development. All of that to ensure that he's bringing in the big bucks. Terry Vinograd remembers that period.
So Fernando decided in his thinking about computers that computers should be used to facilitate human language interactions, not to understand language, which is what my own AI work had originally been. And he had this very clear sort of focus on language as commitment, language as you make promises, you make requests.
And so Fernando takes a page out of the Silicon Valley's playbook and, you guess it, founds a startup. And then another one. And then another.
Fernando wanted to get people together, get them to commit to things and make things happen. Now, in Chile, he did that by being a government minister. In the US, he did not have that option or anything close to it. So he took the same drive that he had to get things organized and make things happen.
So yes, Fernando has all the startups, but there is also a very interesting twist. His early business partner, Werner Erhard, has a shady reputation in the human potential movement, with whispers of cult-like behavior and even money laundering. That Erhard connection remains a thorn in Fernando's side, at least for a while.
I was never comfortable with him because I think even in the early days when Fernando was working with him, there was a critique from the left here, right, about Werner Erhard and what he was doing and whether he was a cult and all those things.
Eventually, Fernando does move beyond his controversial past with Werner Erhard. He's enjoyed some success building a business. And now, some of the Santiago boys are ready to join him in Silicon Valley. But for many of them, it's not about the change of scenery. It's a completely different environment. Gabriel Rodriguez, for example, becomes a vice president in one of Fernando's companies. But Fernando expects him to learn on the go, the moment he lands in California. So Gabriel has to take on the daunting task of learning how to use a personal computer, something he's never used in his life. And he finds himself lost in a sea of electronic confusion.
And then he put me a PC in front of me, an Osborne. And I stayed for 10 days trying to understand what the hell was that. No one explained me. So it took me something like 5 days to get the idea what was a word processor. Like I can erase a word, etc. And every time the whole thing stuck because I did something strange, I switched off a switch that was behind my desk in the office. And I listen always a kind of people shouting, strange, yeah. And then continue working, again a problem, then I turn off and on again what I was disconnected the local area network of the whole office.
For this Santiago boy, using a personal computer proves more challenging than imagining how cybernetics could have transformed the whole of the Chilean economy. Gibbon Siep, the German designer behind the operations room, also enjoys a stint in California. All of that thanks to Fernando's entrepreneurial genius.
One day I got a letter from him from the States, and he invited me to come to Berkeley to see his new environment, what he was doing. I was very impressed because I had not had the opportunity to work with computers, you see.
There are no socialist spoons in sight, of course, but Guy is still loving it.
I was amazed. Of course, it was fascinating to put the perspective to work with this new technology, which I saw what's coming up, you see. Apple started just, I think, to produce its first little 9-inch portable computer.
But some Santiago boys are not as thrilled. Remember Enrique Farnet, who was very skeptical of Fernando claiming to be like Jesus when he wanted to share power with everyone? He's still skeptical, even when Fernando resurfaces in Silicon Valley.
I went to meet Fernando when he came to San Francisco. And then he started getting involved in all this, I don't know what's the label. Erhard was one of these. But this sort of, for me, is also like manipulating people. People, if you know how to touch their buttons, they are weak. And he started getting into that.
Fernando's coaching workshops do enjoy a certain reputation. Some find them rather intimidating. Fernando is not afraid to ask the tough questions to make people squirm in their seats. The fact is that quite a lot of high-powered executives attending the seminars. I'm more than happy to pay top dollar for what seems like a heavy dose of emotional sadomasochism, and Fernando is more than happy to provide it. Eventually, even Gabriel Rodriguez cannot bear it.
Working with Fernando was not an easy experience. For me, it was not so hard because finally I was a friend of him from the beginning and know him very personally. But at the end, he expelled me from his company in public in front of all the other guys. And I was working with him for more than 3 years with no severance pay, nothing. And then after that, my relation with Fernando, starting from there, was different.
In the meantime, the Thatcher era takes a terrible toll on Stafford beer. Vanilla recalls its effects on her father.
There was no doubt ever in my mind that Stafford was a patriot. The patriotism only abandoned him when Margaret Thatcher moved in. The Thatcher years were the end of all of us, of all that we understood about England and the English.
Everyone around him seems to be with Thatcher, even his ex-wife, Vanilla's mother.
She was Mummy's role model. It was awful. I mean, they even had the same hairdresser as far as I can see.
And Stafford's brother, Ian, is not far behind.
Stafford discovered that his brother had spent Christmas at Chequers, the Prime Minister's house, with Margaret Thatcher. And he said to his brother, "You were alone with that woman and you did not strangle her." It was not Uncle Ian's style to strangle prime ministers. He loved Margaret Thatcher, of course.
By 1989, Stafford has had enough of Thatcherism. During an important lecture, he even goes on the offensive.
I was one of the chairs of the conference, and I invited Stafford to do the after-dinner speech at the conference. And my job was, therefore, to sit next to him and to keep him topped up with wine. I had to be on my toes, as everybody knows. He even later in life, he'd given up brandy. He used to be topped up with wine. So he got through 2-3 bottles during the course of his speech.
This is Michael C. Jackson, a professor of management and an acquaintance of Stafford's. The lecture starts off as a ferocious attack on Thatcher's government. Stafford accuses it of systematically destroying Great Britain.
He was worried, and he constantly alluded to the fact to me that this was going to lead him to be arrested.
Michael still finds Stafford's reaction hard to parse.
He seriously believed that Special Branch was going to come in to arrest him during the course of this speech because it was such an amazing attack on Thatcherism, Thatcher's government. Let me tell you where we were. We were in the confines of Queen's College, Cambridge, having an absolutely fantastic meal. This is another way in which radicals are bought out by the status quo and by the establishment. There was not the slightest chance that Special Branch would come in to arrest Stafford.
His passion is unmistakable during that speech, with Stafford taking aim at the American hegemony, the IMF, and the World Bank. But despite his best efforts, it feels like he's talking to a brick wall. His audience doesn't seem to be moved. They're not joining any hippie commune anytime soon. So, once again, not a surprise. By then, his disdain for corporations runs very deep. He goes as far as to call them, and I quote, deeply corrupt. So with an attitude like this, it's no wonder that the business world has turned its back on its foremost management theorist. So as Stafford steps away from the cutthroat business world, his protege Fernando emerges as a force to be truly reckoned with. He's good at making money, really good. But he has bigger dreams than that. He wants to change the way we think about computers. So Fernando teams up with that star professor at Stanford that he met earlier, Terry Vinograd, and together the two write Understanding Computers and Cognition, a fundamental book that challenges almost everything we thought we knew about artificial intelligence and computers. Vinograd and Flores ask us to imagine a different kind of technology, or at least a different approach to thinking and designing technology. They want technologies that somehow improve and facilitate and coordinate our actions, not try to replace them outright, as a lot of these artificial intelligence dreamers have been thinking about. They even build software called the Coordinator to show precisely that, to show that technology can augment our abilities rather than replace them entirely. It's all about coordination, not automation. Terry Vinograd explains.
So it's one of the first messaging systems that used PCs and computer networks of the more primitive kind.
It's a bit like a primitive version of Outlook, with strict protocols for communication, of course. And it proves to be like the Wild West of emails, with some companies swearing by it, while others preferring to steer clear.
You got these stories like people throwing it out over their cubicle walls and stuff like that.
The critics of the Coordinator say that it's too focused on hierarchy and order, and it doesn't leave enough room for the emotional side of communication.
It basically privileges one dimension of communication. So if you wanted to say, I want you to deliver this by tomorrow, it's great. If you say, how are you feeling? There's nowhere to do that.
Some even argue that the Coordinator wrongly assumes that the opinions of managers are to be universally accepted. All the while Fernando's rather abstract musings on language and biology and hermeneutics only serve as a veil that conceals that there is actually a lot of conflict and contention inside every workplace. Gabriel Rodriguez was still around when those controversial reactions start popping up.
I remember an article written by the editor of PC Computing, which was the most important magazine at the time, saying, this is the fascist software, saying you're giving instructions, etc., etc. And this comes from Mr. Flores, who was a minister of Allende, the communist president, etc., etc., etc.
And Cybersyn, remarkably, also comes under fire in the 80s. One prominent critic comes along and says basically, wait a minute, this is not democracy. This is more like fascism. Yes, he's actually saying that Cybersyn is taking away workers' freedoms and letting some unelected experts, who are completely unaccountable to anyone, tell these workers what to do. So yes, he does call it, and I quote, managerial fascism. And he's not some nobody, he's a big deal in philosophy circles, this critic. Once again, Stafford Beer, as this conflict unfolds, finds himself in the hot seat. He has to defend his creation. And once again, he fails to understand the point. The critics of Cybersyn have been voicing their concerns for more than a decade now. They've been arguing that Stafford's cybernetics expertise, however extensive and impressive it is, does not automatically translate into a good understanding of the complexities of particular workplaces. So take the quantified flowchart that he's been so proud of, for example. It may be a cool invention, but is it the only tool? Or the best? Why does Stafford want to impose it on the workers? Instead of listening how they would go about collecting the data, analyzing it, and improving the enterprise? Shouldn't they be designing what a quantified flowchart should look like and not just contributing data to its various components? In fact, Stafford's beloved field of management cybernetics, once you look at it close enough, is a bit of an oxymoron. It seeks to dress up the political maneuverings of management with a scientific patina of some kind. But it's hard to fully buy into the idea. If we truly want a fair workplace, we must constantly question those in charge. he must constantly ask what is their authority based on. And it cannot be simply based on saying, hey, I know about requisite variety, I know about feedback mechanisms, I know about algedonic meters. It cannot be based on expertise alone, not when it comes to management. Of course, the goal of Cybersyn was never to achieve some pinnacle of democratic decision-making. So some of this criticism is not fair. Instead, Cybersyn set out to provide support to managers. But even when Stafford Beer tries to engage citizens, and not just workers and managers, his attempts at democratic politics are a little bit ambiguous. Take Project Cyberfolk in Chile, that little sibling to Project Cybersyn, where he wanted to measure public opinion by having citizens move knobs on a gadget that his son designed to show what they really feel about policies and what they hear discussed on television. You remember that Stafford did want people to react to what the president has been saying, and then to have the president react to what the people are saying about what he is saying, and almost infinitely so with all the cybernetic loops on top of each other. So it's certainly impressive if you think about it, but is it enough for citizens just to turn a dial on a gadget to express what they really think about politics? Don't we want more? Robust discourse, engaged debate, democratic deliberation, and all of that happening in a vibrant public sphere, not reducible just to a number you can pick? Somehow, Stafford is completely mum about these aspects. He just really believes that one can, and not just can but should, reduce politics and critique to a measured scale between 1 and 10. Or whatever that scale might be in a particular case. This does sound a little bit simplistic. So, over time, a few of the Santiago boys start having doubts about Cybersyn. Enrique Farnet, for example, is curious about just what kinds of conversations might have taken place in those cybernetic chairs.
With my experience today, I mean, really, it was a bit naive because you forget other things. The one that talks more is not necessarily the most able. There are things like charisma.
Mario Grandi brings up another fascinating point. Who will even sit in those chairs?
Io mi sono sempre domandato, ma chi entrava nella sala di operazioni? 7 persone? No,
which ministers will sit there? Which heads of parties? Which workers? How will they be selected? None of those questions have been answered. It's true that during times of war, questions like this don't typically arise. That's why operations rooms are so popular in that context. The same goes for police departments and the CIA, where the chain of command is usually very well defined. However, as Mario Grandi notes, politics doesn't work like military headquarters. At least, not in a democracy. Of course, it's fascinating how Stafford and Fernando have caught flack for their work, and in remarkably similar ways. But isn't it also curious that they haven't actually joined forces to combat their critics? And I don't know, write an essay or perform defending management cybernetics? Or whatever the label might be in the case of Fernando? But that doesn't happen. In the first 5 or 7 years after the coup, the two remain rather cordial and helpful to each other. When Fernando is imprisoned, Stafford fights tooth and nail for his release. He even tries to arrange for him to enroll into a PhD program in the United Kingdom. And when Stafford is down on his luck, and Fernando is already making some serious money in Silicon Valley, Fernando also extends a helping hand.
I hired him for a small project for me. I want to help him. He was not good for business. That was another impressive thing. He was a dreamer, a poet.
A big short entrepreneur, Fernando throws Stafford a bone, giving him a little consulting job, for example. Alas, not much comes out of it. When they reunite in Canada, though, much later, the tension between the two is palpable, as Stafford's partner, Alana Leonard, recalls.
One of the things that Stafford mentioned was that Flores told him, "I don't understand why you have less respect for me now than you did back in Chile when I was much younger." And Stafford said, "Well, in Chile, you were the Minister of Economics. Now you're a consultant." No, just, the same kind of thing that I do. I have no need to give you extra respect on the basis of your title.
It's tempting to brush off that tension as just two very opinionated guys working in different paradigms, as Fernando seems to imply when I talk to him about it. Stafford does stay true to cybernetics, his paradigm, while Fernando moves far beyond it, doing things that are truly on the cutting edge, even for Silicon Valley.
Later, when we talk in Canada, I talk about my book with him, Understanding Computer and Cognition, and he was, I believe, very happy that I was able to be a guy, but at the same time disappointed that I was not a cybernetic believer. He still was in his ideas.
But I don't think it's just a matter of two irreconcilable paradigms. Something else is going on here.
Ha avuto sempre un bruttissimo vizio.
Mario Grandi eventually hired Fernando for several big projects for the Italian firms where he's been working. So he gets to know him relatively well even after Chile, after Cybersyn. And Fernando's terrible vice, says Mario, is refusing to pay all of his intellectual debts in full.
Però lui non esiste la gratitudine.
According to Mario, Fernando doesn't do much gratitude or loyalty. So by the time he reaches the top, it's normal that many of the Santiago boys, who initially were rooting for Fernando's success, are no longer willing to support him. And then things get personal. Stafford dedicates his published account of the Cybersyn adventure to none other than Fernando himself, the man who started it all. It's a heartfelt gesture with the dedication reading, and I quote, "to Fernando for our friendship." And there is even a very beautiful and moving aphorism in Spanish that follows the dedication. Fernando too is grateful, at least today.
I believe that without the Cybersyn, I will never have the question that I have after. Without Stafford, better said, no? Not only Cybersyn.
And to his credit, he doesn't downplay the significance that Cybersyn has had on his own career.
I don't believe that I will be Minister of Economic and Finance and any of these things without the project. I didn't have any stature in the political arena before. I was a young engineer.
That's what he says now, anyway. But what did he say back then? 5 years after Stafford's account of Cybersyn gets published, Fernando's big book with Terry Vinograd finally hits the shelves.
I know that Stafford had this certain disappointment that when I published the book with Terry, Computer and Cognition, I give thank you to him like other people. But I don't put a chapter about him.
Fernando, however, is mistaken here. Stafford's name doesn't surface in the book's acknowledgement section. That of Werner Erhard, for example, does. Stafford's name appears only in minor footnotes, and very few of them. That's all the play he gets in that book. As it happens, at some point in the late 80s, Stafford was in fact asked about what he thought about the book that Flores and Vinograd published together. And his response was, let's just say, rather ambiguous.
I find that there is a very strong ethical imperative built into that system. It has to me some of the overtones of religious revivalism, which says either you are for us or against us.
40 years have gone by, but there is no question in Fernando's mind as to who wrote the better book.
Computer and Cognition was more successful than all the book that Stafford was doing.
This apprentice is definitely not a humiliated one. I've often wondered if there is more to the story of Stafford and Fernando than meets the eye. They look so different and yet so similar. As fate would have it, while researching for this podcast, I stumbled upon a British software engineer, a guy called Trevor Hilder. In the 1990s, Trevor tried to build a Stafford-inspired killer app of some kind for Windows, but that didn't work all that well. And Trevor is quite opinionated about these two men, and he doesn't exactly mince words when I ask him about Fernando and Stafford.
They come from a background where particularly middle-aged and old men expect to be listened to by everybody else, and they are the dominant figures.
Trevor, as you can hear, is quite harsh on both of them.
They grew up to be egomaniacs. They were competitive people who were expected to show off all the time and show how clever they are all the time.
So when it comes to this strange duo, it's clear that Stafford plays the good cop to Fernando's bad one. It's hard to envision Stafford screaming something like, "Hope is the raw material of losers," as Fernando has done in his corporate workshops. But then I've noticed another similarity between the two. Stafford and Fernando have both built their consulting careers and reputations by claiming to see things that others simply don't. These two are not your run-of-the-mill eggheads who don't know how to deal with tunnel vision. These two deal with big-picture ideas, systems, emotions, philosophy, and not just this boring quantitative stuff of models and spreadsheets. And when they prophesize the future, that future is always bold, radical, unexpected. Isn't it what we want in our thinkers anyway? Well, not everyone is so sure.
I mean, there's a question as to who is the bigger technocrat. Is it the systems thinkers, or is it the people who are more concerned with optimization algorithms?
This is historian Will Thomas. He's written about technocracy in both government and business. And according to Will, the eggheads are often the humble types. They usually know their place, aware of the limitations of the algorithms. The big picture guys, on the other hand, are different. Guys like Stafford and Fernando have aspirations which are much grander. They're usually the ones to be advising the CEOs, not some heads of, marketing or finance departments. They won't even be wasting time with these junior people.
The people who are systems thinkers, and this includes people who are involved in cybernetics, certainly Stafford Beer, wanted to remain engaged at that level of the executive suite. But they couched what they were doing in, certain rubrics like cybernetics and like systems thinking.
So it's usually the big picture types who are also blind to their own politics.
It might not be a technocracy of the flavor that they imagine technocracy to exhibit itself as, but, I think that certainly, there is a sort of a new age technocratic element to it. They wouldn't think of themselves as technocrats, but they're certainly casting themselves as a particular kind of expert.
Speaking of new age, there is quite a lot of it in the later chapters of our story. While Fernando flirts with Werner Erhard's followers in California, Stafford undergoes his own spiritual awakening in Toronto. His turn to New Age results in a somewhat esoteric, refined approach to management. And one would have thought that it would hurt him as a consultant, but somehow it doesn't. In fact, this new approach keeps earning him consulting contracts, and it also makes him into an intellectual icon for a very prominent consulting firm in Switzerland. But this transformation of Stafford also leaves some of his longtime fans, including people like Brian Eno, for example, truly scratching their heads about what's going on with him.
He more and more assumed the sort of guru figure. That was both in his appearance and in his way of speaking, for example.
Stafford's once scientific theories now seem to be much more mystical in nature.
As time went on, I realized that there was something much more, I almost hesitate to use the word, but I have to, occultish in what he was interested in.
Brian is still not sure what it all means.
I still don't know what to think about all of that, because I don't want to say it was a wrong direction, but it was one that didn't offer much to me, I must say.
As Stafford takes a break, perhaps from teaching tantric yoga, as he often does in Toronto, he gets an unexpected visit from an old friend from his consulting days, a guy called Francisco Sagasti. At the time, Sagasti is just a modest bureaucrat, but you may have heard his name since, because much later he became president of Peru. Yes, weird things happen to the friends of Stafford Beer. But the Stafford that Francisco Sagasti meets in Toronto is not at all the same sharp business executive that greeted him in London's office.
He had moved to the more mythic, more esoteric side. You know, he really went not to the dark side, but to the otherworldly side, in a sense, and lost connection with the other things.
But Stafford's legacy, for all the mystical escapades, is still solid.
You know, he was, at that time, a mythic figure, a tragic figure, someone who inspired us, who showed the way, and we all appreciated that. At least people like me.
It's not all esotericism, of course. In his later years, Stafford has also some radical and still relevant ideas.
Has anybody heard of green money? That doesn't mean greenbacks. You've heard of those. This is money which is artificial. It's created in computers by a barter system. So you can mend roofs, but I want my roof mended, but I've no money to pay you. See? But you like pictures, I can paint pictures.
Was he really into a better version of cryptocurrencies as early as the late 1980s?
If you've got a computer in a community, you can do this on a very complex scale, and you build up green money credit.
So, by now you probably know that there is something undeniably captivating about the way Stafford oscillates between the worlds of science on the one hand and the world of mysticism on the other. And this, I think, is what makes him into such an appealing character to so many people.
He wasn't a unified human being. And I have deepest respect for the guy, but he was not a unified human being.
This is his disciple Trevor Hilder.
He was rich and complex, and a lot of the richness and complexity that he reflects the troubles of the 20th century that he was living in. And there's a sense in which I think the reason why he's such an interesting figure is precisely because different parts of him are different players in the dynamics of all the things that were going on, all sorts of different levels of recursion.
But what becomes of the man who overthrew Allende? Well, in 1988, Pinochet suffers a humiliating defeat in a referendum, and 2 years later, he resigns as president. Stafford is elated to hear the news, and we are lucky enough to have a clip of him on the very day when Pinochet leaves office.
I lived to see this morning something I thought would never happen. Mr. Pinochet removing his sash in Chile.
8 years later, Pinochet steps down as commander of the Chilean armed forces. But will he ever face justice? Curiously, over time, Pinochet develops a peculiar fondness for Britain. You know, all these fans of the Chicago Boys and of Pinochet himself probably get into his brain. And oddly, this fascination with Britain paves the way to his undoing. Andy Beckett of The Guardian explains.
When Pinochet was coming to Britain from the early 90s onwards quite regularly, The part of the country that he was most drawn to was Piccadilly in London, which is a quite elegant, kind of expensive part of London, traditionally an area for kind of private clubs, for often people on the far right of politics to kind of gather and quietly kind of conspire.
Ironically, it's the same area that Fernando Flores, then a young bureaucrat with the Chilean government, visited when he went to his first meeting with Stafford Beer.
When he made his fatal trip in 1998, he was actually wearing the kind of clothes that you still see now on a certain kind of elderly English gentleman in Piccadilly. He was wearing this kind of brown and black tweed checked jacket and a kind of smart tie. And apart from the fact that maybe his shoes were a bit too perfect, you could have thought this is just like another old, maybe ex-military English guy spending time in Piccadilly.
But it's not just Piccadilly. Pinochet is staying at the Athenaeum Club. Yes, the same club beloved by the Santiago boys and Stafford Beer. The club where Cybersyn was born.
The idea of a kind of gentleman's club was something that was quite appealing to him.
Note the irony of the situation. Stafford, with his Chilean post-coup trauma, is doing everything he can to leave his old world behind. In the meantime, Pinochet is frantically trying to fit into that world. Well, Pinochet does get arrested on that very trip. What follows is a complicated legal case that spans 3 countries, Spain, Britain, and Chile. And the person mostly responsible for trapping him, it's none other than John Garces, Allende's political advisor, someone that we've heard a lot from on this podcast. The guy who left La Moneda shortly before the bombing and was told by Allende himself to keep on fighting and tell the Chilean story to the world. It's almost like cosmic justice has finally been served. But in Chile, even with Pinochet gone, justice can sometimes take a while to arrive. This is how one day Gabriel Rodriguez finds himself face-to-face with Manuel Contreras, the feared director of DINA, the intelligence service. Remember, this is the same man who is responsible for sending Gabriel himself to the torture site of Villa Grimaldi and then having him transferred to the Ritoque concentration camp.
I was in the restaurant with the wife of Eugenio, my friend, the widow.
By the way, this is the widow of Eugenio Ruiz Tagle, that Santiago boy who helped with finding the space for the operations room, the one who got killed by the caravan of death shortly after the coup.
And we were having lunch together, and in the table side by side with us arrived Contreras with families, kind of 7, 8 persons in the table. So there was such an impression for Monica, for myself, that we decided to leave the restaurant.
What a chilling ordeal this must have been. To see someone so culpable still enjoying life in what is nominally the new democratic Chile. On one of Fernando's trips back to the new and democratic Chile, he gives a lecture on some innocent subject like innovation or Silicon Valley, but then a mysterious figure from his past reappears.
And this guy was there. And I went to piss. And then the guy was pissing there. I said, "Oh, Fernando," he said. And I said, "I don't speak with people like you. Fuck you." That's what I said to you. Normally I don't do this kind of thing, but this time I have my pleasure.
Who is the lucky fellow? Well, he's the same shadowy individual who attempted, you might remember that from one of the early episodes, to deprive Fernando of Cybersyn. And he may have played a role in orchestrating that meeting between Stafford Beer and Salvador Allende. Well, go figure. But you don't probably want to piss next to Fernando Flores. After years away, Fernando does make a political comeback in his native Chile. And he does so with the help of his former prison mate, Sergio Bitar, we already met many times on this podcast. So he gets elected into office, but once there, Fernando's career takes a surprising turn. So surprising, in fact, that even Sergio Bitar sounds quite a bit embarrassed by its development.
He made big mistakes, so I think that politically. So he used to talk to people about building coordinations and organizations, and he finally left the coalition of the government and created a new party that failed also to support the right here, and also he left.
Fernando makes some ideological shifts, and rather unexpected ones as well.
And even the right didn't recognize him because they didn't want to have something with Allende, somebody linked with Allende to be involved with them.
Even Fernando's closest confidants and collaborators, including Gabriel Rodriguez, struggle to understand this move to the right.
And he moved from the left to the right. And part of my fighting with Fernando was about that. So you cannot do that when you left La Moneda during the bombardment with the Chilean flag or the white flag, because everyone knows that you were with Allende. They don't understand how you moved from here.
Gabriel says that this is typical Fernando, with all of his contradictions.
He incarnates a phenomena of communicating and transforming people, but that capacity has been incarnated in a very simple, concrete human being with a lot of social resentment and with a lot of difficulties in life. So it's a kind of a Greek tragedy person. They have these contradictions in him. He's a good guy, I would say, never do direct harm to people, but harm a lot of people all around.
Eventually, Fernando gets fed up with Chile. He's returning to California. He's had enough. The Santiago Boys has been a story of young men. And I'm sorry for this lack of gender diversity, but we work with what we've got. And this man had a dream. They wanted to create a fair and democratic society in Chile. They wanted to use cybernetics and dependency theory to achieve it all. And they had some pretty radical ideas about how to make that happen. But then, as we all know, things went wrong. A coup d'etat intervened. The government was overthrown. The leader had to commit suicide. The project was shut down. And some of them had even to flee Chile or spend years in jail. It's a sad story, really. And by now you've heard most of it. But it's also an important one, because the Santiago Boys were really ahead of their time. This was something that most people didn't see back then, and many of them still don't see even now. What they saw is that technology and geopolitical power are connected on a global scale. They saw how big corporations can influence governments. They saw how countries can become dependent on these corporations without even realizing it. And they showed us how these countries can fight back with their own tools and their own ideas. But of course, we should not get too starry-eyed here. The Santiago Boys were not perfect by any means. They did have a lot of blind spots. And the fact that they were all boys was surely one of them. But that's not all. They certainly underestimated the perils of technocracy. Nor did they think about how their own work would affect the people who were not like them, the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized. They didn't understand that there were forces out there that wanted to stop them. Forces that had money, power, weapons, advanced technologies. Forces that use technology for evil purposes, not to promote participation or create a more rational economy. Forces like ITT and the CIA, like Manuel Contreras and his secret police, DINA. On these points, the likes of Beatriz Allende, and the militants of MIR were far ahead of our beloved Santiago boys and their political party, MAPU. And they did miss a great opportunity to learn from this more radical crowd, if only about the arts of the dark tag. But we shouldn't judge them too harshly, because they also had something that most people don't have: a vision. A vision of a better world. A world where workers could control their own destiny, and where computers could play a role in national development. A world where middle-class experts believed in something other than making money or making careers. And it's a vision that is worth recovering. And that's why the Santiago boys still matter. But before we finish, let us turn back to Stafford Beer. In his later years, Stafford suffers from terrible health problems. Here's how he puts it in a 1996 interview.
I'm a mess right now. I don't know what to do. I've had one stroke, and I may keel over. I know this. I've got about 10 books I'd like to write, but I can't. I can't write any longer. My hand won't work.
Despite his health problems, though, he keeps spending time at that cottage. But why? Roger Hardman, one of his disciples, has a hunch.
He did start, in my view, dramatizing it as time went on. He didn't need to have the no running water. He didn't need to have a bad telephone system. He didn't have to have no toilet. He could have had those things. He didn't have to have an old Land Rover that he could hardly move the clutch off because he had he has diabetes and he could hardly feel the clutch.
But why not just chill in Toronto? Why not spend all his time there with the love of his life, Alena? Why still go to that isolated cottage in the middle of nowhere?
Now, all those things, I think, were to dramatize his situation and partly a marketing thing. They were to market that I have been there, I've touched the sun, I've been Icarus, and now I've plunged to earth, but I suffered.
Roger grew up poor, but he's never at ease with Stafford's attempts to fit in with the working classes and the poor.
Now, Stafford was of that same generation that loves the negative trappings of Margaret Thatcher. Not her politics, but the trappings of Margaret Thatcher and the High Church. He's a typical benevolent elitist in the UK context.
Selling the mansion and the Rolls-Royce does not do much to him. He's still beholden to his old class.
It's not coldness towards the dispossessed, it's blindness towards the dispossessed. He just doesn't see them. You quietly help them, but not because of any incipient coldness. This is his own intrinsic classness, yes.
Michael C. Jackson shares this view.
He was an upper-class English public school person, had many of those characteristics, understood nothing about the English working class. I think he would find it extremely difficult to get on with ordinary English working class people.
Until his very last day, Stafford could not understand the British reaction to Allende, or for that matter, to his own work for the man. Roger Hardman explains.
He discovered the hard way that for most of the society he would have grown up expecting to belong to, actually regarded him as having betrayed them by the Chilean episode and by living the way he was living. Now, Stafford didn't actually understand that, and he was very puzzled why he wasn't offered all sorts of chairs at universities.
So, Stafford's long stay in that cottage has always puzzled me. Why stay there given his deteriorating health? Was it his own way of proving something to himself or to others? Was it Stafford's own version of dying inside La Moneda? I still don't know the answer. But it's clear that the grand narrative of his own life, from the luxurious mansion to that austere cottage to everything in between really, has helped in achieving one crucial task. It has helped in creating a myth that still captivates and challenges us. And maybe it's that myth, more than the actual achievements of Cybersyn as a project, that is truly important in this story. Francisco Sagasti, the former Peruvian president, seems to believe so as well.
He was a great myth teller, a great myth maker. And you know the importance, we all know from Campbell and so on, the importance of myth in our lives. So this is what he was good at. He could create a story that would inspire people, that would make you explore other things like that, that for those like me who are highly skeptical of some things, sowed a little bit of seeds of doubt, but at the same time recognize what it could do.
There are myths, of course, and then there is Stafford's Cybersyn tale. It's in a class of its own. Just think about it. More than 50 years after it began, we're still unpacking its meaning, trying to decipher what it all meant. It's a story that defies logic and reason, a little bit like a surreal fable from, Borges maybe. Oddly enough, the world remembers Cybersyn, but not for its success. Rather, it's a prototype that somehow becomes accepted as the real deal, as if society chose to believe the unbelievable. So, plenty of mysteries still remain, but they're probably better dealt with by psychoanalysts or sociologists, anthropologists of myth. Still, I've spent many months inside Stafford's head, and I must say that living there, even as a squatter, armed with oral histories and archival documents, has been quite the adventure. So I fully agree with what Stafford's disciple, Trevor Hilder, had to say about the man.
He was a character who got trapped not just between two worlds, but he kind of fell through the cracks between many different worlds, and nobody knew. I don't think he knew where he was in these worlds, and he became a marginalized figure because he didn't know how to fit respectably into any of these worlds. So his experiences had catapulted him into not fitting in anywhere, and he really found that very uncomfortable.
In the end, Stafford's daughter Vanilla gets it right.
He was a good fun man, for all this great heaviness and emptiness and despair.
As we have finally reached the end of our story, you might be wondering just what happened to our fascinating cast. So let me indulge your curiosity. Let's start with the one and only Stafford Beer, the visionary behind it all. He died in 2002, and while you might think that someone like him would have a lot of admirers and followers, that was not the case when he died. His own extended family, back in 1989, didn't even invite him to their family reunion, and hundreds of other people showed up. He did continue experimenting with art, publishing poetry, he even had an exhibition of his paintings, but it also met with mixed success. His one work of fiction, for example, was rejected by his publisher, and it did dabble a little bit in certain themes that today we might call pornographic. And when he tried to present one of his academic books, back at the Athenaeum Club, the presentation had to be cancelled for lack of interest from the audience. He did try to keep working on Cybersyn-like projects in other Latin American countries, but he didn't get very far. It seems that, at the time, his ideas were simply too radical and too far-reaching for most people and governments to accept. But there is one surprising person who did appreciate Stafford Beer's work: David Bowie. Yes, that David Bowie, the rock star. He even listed Stafford Beer's book, The Brain of the Firm, as one of his top 10 favorite books ever. That must have done a lot for his book sales. But it's not just the likes of Brian Eno and David Bowie who celebrated Stafford Beer. I already told you that there was this Swiss consulting firm that tried to promote Stafford's legacy in the business world. And by the way, they still hold copyright and intellectual property to a lot of his writings and images, and I must thank them for giving me the permission to quote from some of the letters. And in an old twist, the Swiss consultants actually managed to successfully pitch the operations rooms, modeled on Stafford's thinking, to governments and public authorities in places like China and Vietnam. So Stafford's ideas might be enjoying a strange afterlife in some socialist and communist contexts. Moving on to the darker side. Pinochet passed away in 2006, and his right-hand man, Manuel Contreras, was eventually sentenced to over 5 centuries in prison. More than 3,000 Chileans lost their lives to the dictatorship, and tens of thousands more were taken, imprisoned, and subjected to torture. Currently, there are still more than 1,000 people whose whereabouts and fate remain unknown. Operation Condor claimed the lives of more than 100 victims, and suspicions linger to this day as to whether the CIA and other agencies may have known more about the murderous nature of Operation Condor than they originally let on. Here's why. Remember in one of the last episodes, I casually dropped this factoid that Brazil supplied other countries participating in Operation Condor with this fancy encryption technology that they got from a firm in Switzerland. So this firm, as it turns out, was actually owned by the CIA. So it is not impossible that all the telex traffic that all the secret agencies were exchanging, the ones in Chile and Brazil and Argentina, about whom to kill, when to kill, how to kill, was actually read by someone at the CIA, perhaps sitting in that fancy operations room on the 7th floor of the Langley headquarters. ITT still exists, but it has lost much of its power and influence. Remember the explosion with which we started this story? There were many others that followed, mostly in Europe. In Switzerland, in Italy, in France, in Germany. The one in Manhattan, just a few weeks after the coup, was claimed by the Weather Underground, the far-left terrorist group. And they cited the coup in Chile and ITT's supposed involvement in it as their motivation. Allende, on the other hand, has been voted as Chile's best politician in history. As for his daughter, Beatriz, she resurfaced in Havana almost immediately after the coup, hoping to continue her father's work. However, it proved impossible. The trauma of what happened must have been too much. So 4 years after her father's suicide, she too killed herself. And she did that, reportedly, using the very gun that Fidel Castro gave her. Today, the Allende family are still involved in Chile's politics. The daughter of Beatriz, for example, became the defense minister in the new progressive government. This too is a remarkable development, given that her mother was trained as a guerrilla fighter, and it was the Chilean military that overthrew her grandfather and eventually led to his suicide. And imagine, now his granddaughter is in charge of the military as Minister of Defense. As for the Santiago boys, I can give you some brief updates about their subsequent careers as well. Some of them made their way back into the government, with Sergio Bitar, for example, serving as minister in multiple administrations. Gabriel Rodriguez, too, became an ambassador for science and technology, working in the foreign ministry. Others resurfaced in the business world. Raúl Espejo pursued an academic and consulting career. He even joined the Athenaeum Club at Stafford Beer's urging. Mario Grandi and Enrique Fernet pursued business careers in Europe. Gibbon Siap, the designer behind the operations room, kept moving between Argentina and Brazil. Carlos Sena, the Brazilian engineer who prepared that anti-torture report that got him in trouble before he joined Cybersyn, eventually returned to his native country, in Brazil, and there he built computer models for the governor. That's an interesting footnote. The very governor who dared to nationalize ITT's holdings in his state in the early 1960s. We mentioned him briefly before, really in passing. As for Cybersyn, Stafford's ability to craft a myth and a legend around it has definitely paid off, and handsomely so. The story of Cybersyn seems to captivate millions of people around the world, even though the project itself was never fully realized, at least not to the full of his intentions. Cybersyn has become a cultural phenomenon, spawning songs, blankets, and even tech startups that now claim Stafford's legacy. And his ideas still attract plenty of young, loyal fans who flock to hear about them at fancy leftist conferences, which, as soon as they mention Cybersyn among their panels, regularly sell out. But sometimes myths can get out of hand. They can obscure the truth. They can create confusion. And I must say that I kind of feel that something like this is happening with Cybersyn as well. And it's been going on for quite a few years now. I particularly enjoyed one telling anecdote that Fernando Flores shared with me. He mentioned a very prominent global public intellectual, whose name I'm not going to mention, who once approached him and on discovering that Fernando was from Chile, had asked him if he, Fernando, had ever heard about Project Cybersyn. That was one way to hurt his ego. As for Fernando, he's definitely not done yet. He says he has more secrets to share about Cybersyn, the coup, the real relationship between Pinochet and Prats and Allende, and so much more, and he'll probably do that in his next book. A book that will surely sell more copies than all of Stafford's combined. For now, the website of Fernando's latest business venture features a glowing testimonial from someone formerly in the US military. This will probably not earn him any extra admiration with the one-time Chilean leftists who so admired and supported him. And here is the most bizarre anecdote of them all. Remember Terry Vinograd, Fernando's colleague at Stanford University, the one who says that he owes Fernando a huge intellectual debt? Well, he went on to mentor, wait for it, Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, and other tech moguls sat in on his classes too. He was even the master's program advisor to the young Peter Thiel. So a specter might in fact be haunting California, the specter of Cybersyn. But without a visionary leader like Allende, or a genius tech mythmaker like Stafford Beer, it remains just that, a specter, a socialist ghost in the cybernetic machine. So this is where we leave you today, with one last question to ponder. Whatever happened to that futuristic room in Santiago? Did the dictatorship blow it up? Did they sell it for parts? Well, I heard from a reliable source that the room was still there, untouched, in May of 1974. So good 8 months after the coup. And then we lose trace of it. It just disappears, just like that. No one knows how or why or who did it, or where it went. Maybe it's still out there, waiting to be discovered. And what about those cool chairs and fancy screens? Where did they end up? Could they be in some exotic place, like a beach house in Las Cruces, or a cottage in Wales? I, for one, wouldn't be surprised to hear that they ended up somewhere like that. But at the end of the day, that's a kind of thought, a tantalizing one, that would keep some of us gassing late into the night. And perhaps that's what Stafford himself would have wanted. It's the kind of puzzle that he would have loved. He loved ambiguity. So perhaps it's better to leave this question unanswered.
I don't know what the future holds. I am a great proponent of ambiguity. It's partly because I'm as interested in art as I am in science. The potency of poetry and of painting quite clearly has to do with this very ambiguity. And I think that an understanding of the future has to have the same kind of feel about it. Most of the mistakes, after all, that we have made in trying to adapt to the future in our kind of age and civilization have been entirely due to misclassifying what was going on, in my opinion.
The Santiago Boys is a co-production of Cora Media and Post Utopia. Writing, research, development and presentation, Evgeny Morozov. Music main theme, Luca Michele. Audio editing and post-production, Emanuele Moscatelli. Music supervisor, Luca Michele. Post-production assistant, Luca Possi. Post-production producer, Matteo Celsa. The people who've been helping me to organize, record, and process hundreds of interviews are unfortunately too many to name here. But I'd like to extend special thanks to Chiara Di Leone, Ekaits Cancella, Nikolai Maximchuk, and Matteo Miavaldi, all of whom helped me in more than one way. Full credits are also available on the podcast website, the-santiago-boys.com.